Welcome back to CIA Declassified. Take a breath. Now imagine you're 60 feet below the surface. The water is perfect turquoise. You're Fidel Castro, the man who has survived hundreds of assassination attempts. You see it, a magnificent Queen Conch shell. Glowing with an unnatural, shimmering light, you reach out, but you aren't picking up a souvenir. You're picking up a detonator. In 1963, the CIA's Technical Services Division, TSD, decided that the best way to eliminate the Cuban leader was through his favorite pastime. They didn't want a bullet, they wanted a blast from the abyss. This sounds like a Looney Tunes plot, but the paperwork is sitting in the National Archives. The agency's plans centered on the Queen Conch, a large marine snail common for the Caribbean. The CIA's plan was to find a shell large enough to hold a significant amount of high explosives, then paint it with vivid colors to ensure it caught Castro's eye. A quote from a declassified TSD memorandum: the shell would be loaded with explosives and placed in an area where Castro was known to skin dive. The device would be triggered by a pressure-sensitive mechanism when lifted from the seabed. End quote. Desmond Fitzgerald, the head of the CIA's Cuban task force, was the primary backer of the plan. He tasked the agency's lab with creating a waterproof detonator that could withstand the corrosive salt water for days while waiting for the target. The CIA consulted with marine biologists to determine which shells were most likely to attract a diver's attention, eventually settling on the iridescent coating to make the trap look like rare treasure. Quote from a report on assassination plots: the idea was rejected after it was determined that there was no shell in the Caribbean area large enough to hold a sufficient amount of explosive, which was also spectacular enough to be certain of attracting Castro's attention. End quote. The agency's marine demolition logs show they even considered using a midget submarine to plant the shell just hours before Castro arrived at his favorite diving spot to ensure the batteries didn't die. The explosive chosen was likely Comp B, a high-velocity military explosive that is stable underwater but devastating when triggered by a blasting cap. The CIA experimented with biological deterrence, considering if they could poison the inside of a real shell so that even if Castro survived the blast, he would succumb to a neurotoxin. One declassified memo suggests the shell was to be placed precisely at a depth of 30 to 50 feet, the range where Castro was known to dive without heavy scuba gear, and the Marine lab in Miami actually built several prototypes of the exploding shell, testing the buoyancy to make sure it didn't float away or roll into a crevice. The plan was scrapped in late 1963, not because of ethics, but because the CIA couldn't find a way to guarantee that a random tourist or a Cuban fisherman wouldn't pick up the shell first. Another version of the diving plot involved a gift of a contaminated wetsuit that was treated with Madura, foot fungus, and tuberculosis bacteria. The CIA spent approximately $15,000, a huge sum at the time, on the preliminary research into marine attractants and high-pressure waterproofing. Declassified files show that the agency's Special Operations Division had a specific team of frogmen ready to deploy the shell from a clandestine boat off the Cuban coast. The exploding seashell is now cited in the Church Committee reports as one of the most ingenious but impractical schemes ever devised by the U.S. government. CIA records indicate that the Technical Services Division specifically sought out shells with fluted edges, believing the complex geometry would help hide the seams of the internal explosives compartment from a suspicious diver. To achieve the unnatural glow, the agency's chemist experimented with radioactive isotopes mixed into the paint, ensuring the shell would be visible even in the silty water stirred up by Caribbean currents. Quote from a TSD technical analysis: reliability of the underwater firing chain is paramount. Any failure in the pressure switch would result in the loss of a high-value operational window and potential compromise of the marine assets. End quote. The agency considered using a time-delayed fuse that would only arm itself 4 hours after placement, allowing the CIA frogmen to be miles away before Castro ever entered the water. Biological research by the agency suggested that Castro was particularly fond of Strombus Guy gas, leading the CIA to exclusively source that specific species for the bomb's exterior. When you read the operational discontinuance, the redactions are as deep as the ocean floor. The heaviest redactions are in the target site selection section. Speculation suggests these bars hide the fact that the CIA had already planted non-explosive test shells in Cuban waters to track Castro's movements, and the blacked out text describes the Cuban civilians who were accidentally injured during the dry runs. Further speculation surrounds the chemical signature section. Conspiracy theorists believe the redacted text describes a secret scent marker used in the water to lure Castro toward the shell, and the black bars hide the formula for a pheromone that can override human instinct. There is a theory that the redactions hide the Soviet discovery. Speculation holds that the KGB actually found one of the prototype shells and used it to blackmail a U.S. official, with the black bars hiding the embarrassing details of the payoff. Some speculate the redactions hide the dolphin connection. The theory is that the CIA wasn't going to use divers to plant the shell, but trained dolphins from Project Oxygas. We have an episode on that. And the bars hide the animal asset failure rates. Conspiracy theorists often point to the JFK connection. The speculation is that the shell plot was canceled on the same day as the assassination in Dallas, and the redacted files hide a stand-down order that linked the two events. Finally, there is some speculation that the shell wasn't meant to explode, but to act as a portal. The theory is that the iridescent paint was a radioactive marker for an overhead platform to beam energy directly at Castro, similar to the V effect we discussed before. There is speculation that the seafloor mapping redactions hide the location of a lost Soviet nuclear warhead that the CIA stumbled upon while looking for a place to put the shell. Some theorists believe the black bars in the detonator design section hide the use of acoustic triggers, speculation being that the shell was designed to explode only when it heard a specific frequency of Castro's favorite outboard motor. A persistent theory suggests the redactions hide the double agent logs, speculation that the CIA's shell painter was actually working for Havana and was painting warning signs on the shells in a spectrum only the Cubans could see. Finally, some speculate the redactions hide the end-of-life data for the project, where the CIA supposedly dropped all the leftover exploding shells into a trench off the Florida Keys, leaving a minefield of art for future generations. There is intense speculation that the blacked out logs in the environmental impact section hide a plan to use the shell to trigger a localized underwater landslide, which would create a small tsunami to wash Castro out to sea. Some researchers speculate that the redactions hide a phase 2 of the project, where the CIA planned to release genetically modified killer sea urchins into the same diving area to ensure Castro couldn't escape. Conspiracy theorists suggest the redacted disposal section hide the fact that one of the live exploding shells was never recovered and remains active on a Cuban reef to this day, waiting for a diver's touch. There is a theory that the black bars hide the witness speculation that a CIA defector tried to warn Castro about the shells, and the redactions cover the agency's mission to silence the whistleblower before they reached Havana. Finally, some speculate that the redactions hide a connection to Operation Northwoods, suggesting the exploding shell was part of a larger plan to stage a fake Cuban attack on American divers to justify a full-scale invasion. Was the exploding Seashell plot a success? In terms of its goal, a total failure. Castro outlived the project by over 50 years, but as a technical exercise, it pushed the boundaries of marine engineering. It proved the CIA could create high-pressure, long-silk explosives that could survive in the harshest environment on Earth. The shell never went off, but the ripples are still felt. Operational breakthroughs, hydrostatic detonators. The research led to new ways to trigger underwater mines based on depth and pressure changes. Corrosion-resistant electronics. The CIA's work on the shell's circuitry contributed to the development of modern long-life underwater surveillance. Visual attractant science. The study of what catches the eye underwater was later used to design better survival gear and markers for downed aircraft. Clandestine marine insertion. The project refined the methods used by Navy SEALs and CIA divers to plant devices in enemy harbors without being detected. The exploding seashell reminds us that when the CIA wants someone gone, they aren't just thinking about guns and poison, they're looking at the very beauty of the natural world and wondering how to make it go bang. Thanks for listening. Next time we're going to examine Operation Dark X. Deep in the declassified archives, tucked under the boring title of Analysis of Radar Interference, lies a series of reports on anomalous aerial objects. These aren't just weather balloons or Soviet spy planes. We'll look at the CIA's own radar logs from the 1950s that tracked objects moving at speeds that defy physics. Why did the agency hide UFO data inside technical radar manuals? And what did they see over the Nevada desert that they still won't explain? Join us for the radar shadows. In the meantime, I'll see you in the archives.